He has this reputation for being the quintessential Farage whisperer. The very drug dealers who he said he would launder money for were in actual fact the US authorities. They were undercover FBI agents, and Posh George is thrown in prison.
Welcome to this bonus edition of The State of It. I am here with one of our former hosts, Gabriel Pogrund, who has actually moved on to bigger and better things, arguably. He is now editor of Insight and has this week produced a quite extraordinary story about Nigel Farage and some benefits in kind he has received from a convicted fraudster called George Cottrell. So, Gabriel, do you want to just start by, this looks like a hell of a lot of work has gone into this with you and your team.
Well, let me begin by saying that I genuinely really miss seeing you and Patrick and Lara in the studio. And I also miss the rhythm of my life where I used to get to do things every week. So part of the concept of Insight is that we dedicate lots of time and resource to, an occasional big bomb. And I guess one hopes it's worth it by the time you get there. But we did feel leaving the office on Saturday that we had nothing left to give. And it seems like the story's done reasonably well. The podcast, Posh George, as well, is available to listen to. But the thrust of the story relates, as you said, to this guy, George Cottrell, who is a very colourful character. He's an aristocrat. He grew up in the Caribbean island Mustique, went to boarding school in Worcestershire, and then was expelled for gambling-related activity and responded to that setback by going into the bit of Mayfair where Arab, Russian, British money mingles in hotel lobbies and clubs. And he essentially became very proficient at moving money around the world, learned a lot about the highways and byways of the slightly grayer areas of international finance. And that led him to do something that would catch up with him in due course for reasons I'll explain. He went onto the dark web and posed under an alias and offered to launder money for a drug trafficking syndicate. He then went to meet the drug traffickers at a hotel in Las Vegas and told them that he would happily wash $20,000 of ill-gotten gains. And that, George Cottrell thought was that. And he goes into the world of not reform, but it's forerunner, or at least the forerunner to the forerunner. Before we had reform, we had the Brexit Party, and before that, there was Ukip. And Cottrell becomes a figure in Ukip. He becomes he's a volunteer. I think he became connected because his uncle, via marriage, is Lord Hesketh, the F1 motor racing entrepreneur and a hereditary peer who switched to Ukip. And through that, he basically becomes a sort of super volunteer in Ukip. He has this reputation for being the quintessential Farage whisperer. He knows better than anybody when Nige needs a cigarette or a pint or a moment's pause. He's there to pull the chair from under his table when he's getting to a place. He is just the person who understands Nigel on an intuitive, emotional, political, personal level. And that was responded to with a series of very serious promotions for the young man nicknamed Posh George at a tender age. He became deputy treasurer of Ukip and later chief of staff. And he was there with Farage, cheek by jowl, on referendum night in 2016. And he was also there, critically, to go watch Donald Trump at his Republican National Convention inauguration as a presidential candidate in Cleveland, Ohio, a few months after the Brexit result. And he was with Nigel Farage when they were both getting a connecting flight via Chicago back to the UK when a phalanx of federal officers approaches Posh George, take him away, and in time he learns that the very drug dealers who he said he would launder money for were in actual fact the US authorities. They were undercover FBI agents, and Posh George is thrown in prison, indicted with 21 charges, pleads guilty to wire fraud after doing a deal with prosecutors to give them information, and essentially spends a period of time in a federal prison. And there's a very long story, but the short version of it, taking us to the present, is that he gets out, goes and moves, of course, to Montenegro, where he becomes a crypto gambling entrepreneur. And then, in the run-up to the last general election, he starts funding a great number of different facets of Nigel Farage's life and operation.
And it's pretty, I mean, it's a lot, Gabriel, looking through your splash at the weekend and your long read, which you can read on the Times website. But we are talking security, staff, accommodation, social media stuff as well. And Nigel Farage's contention is that he's doing all of this as his friend in a personal capacity. But it's the scale of the benefits in kind, I think, which is particularly eye-catching, Gabriel.
That's right. It's also the fact that, as you outlined, that it covers so many aspects of Farage's life. So there was once upon a time a thing called the Office of Nigel Farage, which had a website and premises, but it didn't exist as a legal entity. It transpires large amounts of it were just Posh George depositing monies, in the words of his lawyers, into the accounts of people who were there to serve Farage. So Farage gets his own videographer to revamp his TikTok. When the election came, a lot of people said that Farage's TikTok game was way better than anybody else's. A third of people get their young news via TikTok. Farage is really great at TikTok. It transpired that was a man paid to do the work by Cottrell. And you talked as well about his wider staff. So one person who went on to work in the Parliamentary office, another person who was involved in a sort of hipster fascist group called Generation Identity. There's sort of various interesting figures involved in this. But yeah, I think the thing that is quite remarkable about it is that the £5 million gift from the crypto billionaire Christopher Harborne, which came days before Farage said he would stand, it is, as Farage has repeatedly told us, money which was his to spend as he wished, and he won't say if he spent it and how.
He says that he hasn't spent a penny of
Yes.
it. You know that tortuous broadcast round of interviews. So that money is sitting there because presumably there is a risk he might have to pay it back at some point. But either way, he hasn't spent any of that, but there was another source of money.
So essentially, the overall purpose of the MP's Code of Conduct is to uphold democracy by preserving transparency and ensuring that any benefit which a reasonable person might think might have an effect on the actions or words of an MP is disclosed, so that we and the public are satisfied that there's no hidden reason why somebody might be doing something. Because every MP says, yeah, the only reason I took that suitcase of cash was because he's a mate, but it had no effect on my then lobbying for his business. That's the argument. So we need to know who's paying you, and then we can all be in the clear. And there is some small print, and it says that MPs are required to also disclose any benefits received in the year preceding their election. And the only exemption is for, quote, purely personal gifts.
Okay, well, one of the things I wanted to look at is obviously part of Reform's response to this has been to go on the offensive both against you and the Sunday Times more broadly. And some would say it playing the man, not the bull. And there has been a kind of general criticism that, you know, he's a Labour stooge, all of that kind of stuff. Well, I would have thought if you are a Labour stooge, you've got a pretty good way of hiding it. I mean, your track record of very difficult stories for Labour, I would say that you did more to make Keir Starmer's life difficult than any other journalist out there. I mean, from the off about his donations for his clothing, your book that you did with Patrick. I mean, you are indiscriminate and totally apolitical from where I sit. And I think I know that off Labour, I know that from the Tories. It is universally acknowledged that you are absolutely down the middle in the way you do your reporting.
Thank you so much, Steve, for those very kind words. I guess, yeah, this is one of those cases where my hope is that the reporting will do the talking, because the facts have not been disputed. And if the facts seem to have some public interest, and if the thrust of the story seems to relate something that matters, then I'm happy. And I think you've outlined that I've been extremely mischievous and done things that have led to no shortage of opprobrium from the Labour Party, and I've got the same from the Tories, and I'm getting the same from Reform, and that's okay as long as the work itself withstands scrutiny. And it seems so far it has, not least because all the relevant parties have acknowledged the bulletproofness of the information behind it. So I'm pleased if that's the case, and I can only say that it's not just about me, but Sunday Times has also been accused of being a Labour paper, and in the end we're not on anything or any one paper. We just try to write stories that entertain and inform our readers, and I guess we'll keep doing that.
I guess we should talk about where this goes next in terms of This now sits there with the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards. Now, he is already looking at a connected but different case in its own right. And this is the case of Christopher Harborne, who is another crypto billionaire who's given £5 million to Nigel Farage. And Nigel Farage says this was a gift, and it was so much was a gift that I had a contract drawn up to clarify that this was a gift from him to me, and I can do with that money what I want. I can spend it as I wish. But that also was not declared, and that investigation is already taking place. It's quite a way down the line. We don't think he's spoken to Farage yet, but that's ongoing. So it looks like, Gabriel, the next step is that this ends up on the desk of this guy, Daniel Greenberg, who is the Commissioner for Parliamentary Standards, and this process can take quite some time.
Yeah, it can. And it is one of those moments, by the way, where a lot of politics suddenly hinges on the discretion of a person nobody has ever heard of. So the thing about the MP's Code of Conduct is it's not a penal code. There's no common law. There are not long jurisprudential opinions on it. It's words. And the person entrusted with interpreting the words is this legal scholar, Daniel Greenberg, and then his interpretation of the words leads to recommended sanctions, which MPs can then uphold and rubber stamp or not. So it's not like there is there's no CPS guidance here. It's going to come down to how people consider the particulars of the case. And you are right also, Steve, that these things don't tend to resolve themselves in a hurry. There's often written correspondence between the MP under investigation and the Commissioner. There'll be evidence exchange. There will be sometimes video or in-person sessions. And so, yeah, basically it does put a question mark over Farage's future. That's not to say, by the way, that he's unlike a lot of MPs in that if, say, you are a slightly naughty Lib Dem or Tory MP who's had his snout in the trough or done something foolish that's going to lead to your suspension for more than 10 days and thus trigger a by-election or at least create that opportunity, in 9 times out of 10, it's like, okay, well, you're toast. All MPs think they've got a personal mandate and then reality punches them in the face. Farage is very different because the question is not just could this lead to his expulsion from the Commons or his defeat in the by-election, but could he then use that as a weapon? I don't say that but it would be good or because it would be bad, but just kind of observationally, clearly Farage's position in relation to all of this, I'm not making about me, myself and I here. It's broader. He says all of this is part of an establishment crusade against him. And so the question is, might he lean into it? I feel like the idea that he might step down to run in on that basis is slightly underpriced. I don't know. There's no sourcing behind that, but just thinking in terms of the political gravity of the situation, why subject yourself to purgatory in a formal investigation? Maybe he'll seize the agenda and run on a ticket to defy the establishment and give them a bloody nose. I don't know, but that's what Farage, he has this adversarial relationship with the Fourth Estate at the moment. He's angry. He doesn't think it's right. You've seen him on broadcast. Then there's a separate politics, which I think, Steve, you are, as ever, the best political journalist to ask about, which is just where it lands him in terms of the internal politics of reform. And that I don't know so much about, other than to say that you can tell, just reading the papers, that there has been a shift, and that shift is that the question of Farage, yes or no, good or bad, is just back on the table, or is on the table, basically for the first time since he returned back in June 2024 to the political fray.
I think, look, so there are two consequences that flow. One, the one that you've identified, the sanctions issue, right? Will he be expelled as an MP? Will he have to refight Clacton? All of that. But two, it is the broader issue. We have seen a lot less of Nigel Farage recently. Since The Guardian first reported on the undisclosed £5 million payment, there have been far fewer. I remember last year and last summer in particular, we couldn't move for Farage press conferences. And then more broadly, I think one of the issues is that, look, why is Nigel Farage coming under this scrutiny? It is because he wants to be Prime Minister. He is open about that. He wants to run the country. And with that comes a level of scrutiny. And sometimes the issue with that scrutiny, and this is with politicians of all colours, be they Nigel Farage, Boris Johnson, Keir Starmer, whoever they are, all of these questions arise. And it can dominate the bandwidth bandwidth in a way that is unhelpful to your cause. So I am sure Nigel Farage would probably rather be talking about small boat crossings, his economic vision, all of those kind of things. And instead, he's going to get dragged back to this question. GB News, which is a channel which he had a show on and is a kind of problem, is yesterday gave Robert Jenrick one of the most aggressive grillings of all of the grillings that I saw of Robert Jenrick. Camilla Tominey over there did a kind of forensic job at her end in going through it. And that's the point. It kind of sucks up a lot of the bandwidth. And that's the challenge that Reform are going to face. And what I would argue is this is actually part and parcel with, yes, Reform are a really significant political force. Yes, they could win the next election. And as a result, with that is coming a lot of scrutiny.
100%. And I think that the issue as well is that Nigel Farage he's an incredible politician. You can't dispute the fact that there are a few people who have shaped the course of events in our country in the way that he has over the last decade, but before that too. I think the part of his appeal lies in the fact that he looks like he's having fun a lot of the time, and he's can interact with anybody, and in ways which Keir Starmer must from time to time envy, can sink pints with people or go into a old age home and just, you can see he'll be like riotously laughing within a minute. And that is part of his aesthetic and no doubt part of his appeal. And he looks normal, he looks not like a Westminster creature. But when you are put in a vice in this way, and you are forced to talk about things that you feel you talked about. Also, probably we underprice it in our profession, and probably most members of the public have no idea the reality of when you're doing rounds, where after a round is a sort of media ritual where a given person will be put up to represent their party for that day, and they might do like seven small interviews in succession. And the last time Farage did that, it just looked like he just really was not enjoying himself one bit, and he was very angry about it. And you could tell, I don't think he's clearly angry, he would acknowledge he's very angry. And it just, the ability to combine levity with seriousness, the ability to rise above or look different to Westminster is a vital part of his appeal. And this forces him to look and sound like something slightly different.
And let's face it, these are highly unusual arrangements, and he is a highly unusual politician, which he would argue is why he's in this. But you're essentially in a position where he had, as he puts it, an undisclosed gift of £5 million deposited into his account to spend as he sees fit, on Ferraris, whatever he wishes, homes, security, you name it. And then separately, he's got another guy who is funding his security, his staff, and that obviously leads to questions, because these are unorthodox things. And I think when you step back more broadly, one of the things about Reform that is very striking is they are receiving enormous amounts from crypto billionaires. And this is a new feature of politics, and it is transforming the world of politics and money in a way that I've not seen before, because the money that we're talking about, Christopher Harborne, who has recently registered to vote in the UK, we revealed the other week, has given 12 million plus already. So 12 million quid, 9 million in one go. Ben Dello, another crypto billionaire who is a Reform donor, just relocated from Hong Kong back to the UK, given 4 million already. These are huge sums, and it is partly or part of what is going to make and is making Reform an insurgent force, that they are not a kind of unprofessional outfit anymore. They've got big money, and with that money they're recruiting a lot of people, and you're seeing that as part of the operation. But that does bring scrutiny on where that money is from and what it's being used for, and that it has the potential to change politics and to put Nigel Farage in number 10. But equally, inevitably, there are questions about some of that money.
Yeah, I think Fraser Nelson, for your fine noble paper, has been one of the most eloquent commentators on this kind of not quite military industrial complex, but kind of politics money complex of crypto on one side and Reform on the other. Usually the kind of, I think Fraser said that the sort of essential concept underpinning ethics in public life is that people do everything they can to draw a distinction between commercial interests and their public positions, and they wouldn't want there to be any cross-contamination. Whereas, Farage actually is, he's utterly unapologetic in saying, yes, I advocate for crypto. Yes, I have lobby the Bank of England and its governor in relation to crypto. Yes, I'm funded by people with commercial interest in crypto. And, for him, it's not even a bone of contention because he says he thinks what he thinks anyway. And I suppose the problem is in terms of the rules, but maybe also just politics full stop, is it doesn't really always matter what the politician says. The MP's code of conduct has this idea of a reasonable person. So your average punter, would they have grounds to think that something might seem political about this, or that there might be a political dimension to this gift that ought to be declared? And Farage is not the arbiter. And that's another thing, by the way, too, as well, that is worth saying, is you get some politicians, Boris Johnson's another, who are amazing on the campaign trail. You kind of personify insurgent politics, and they feel free being able to interact with people directly and present their position. But when you enter Westminster, the Palace of Westminster is not always so interested in what you want to do. It has its rules, and also because it's sovereign, it can administer them in its own way on its own timeline. And that's another one as well. It's like, you can say and do certain things when you're outside, but when you're here, suddenly it's quite a forbidding and intimidating environment. And it's a bit like Partygate, where you think, it's not fully in our hand and we all want to get on top of it and understand it. But these aren't people that talk to journalists. They're not people who make the decision until they've signed on the dotted line and sent the recommendation to the Standards Committee. So it's a very uncertain time for the whole political geography of the country when you think about the significance of what reforms achieved. It's cannibalised so much of the Tory party. It's taken a sledgehammer to Labour's base. It's done really well north of the border in Scotland. What is that without Nigel Farage? Could it be forced to go on without him? You can't ignore that has become a question as a result of the 5 billion disclosure with which I had no involvement in, and then also latterly this George Cottrell business. So we approached all relevant parties for comment prior to our story. Nigel Farage has since said that he is a victim of an anti-establishment hit job, and that he is considering legal action against the Sunday Times. Lawyers for him said that he did not need to declare the benefits, owing to the fact that they took place in a period where he was not a politician, and/or that they came from a personal friend. George Cottrell has repeatedly said he expected nothing in return for the benefits he conferred upon Farage, that he does what he does because of his genuine friendship and political sympathy with Farage, and that he is guilty of no wrongdoing in this instance. And on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, you can find our new podcast, Posh George, the criminal behind Farage.